So I've recently tried to do a likeness sculpture to render as a character portrait. And this is quite challenging because I'm not a good sculptor. And in the past, I've only ever done original characters. And I feel like I've had to learn the hard way by making a lot of mistakes. So I've compiled what I've learned in my self taught journey into 5 tips to hopefully give you a broad direction on the most important aspects to think about when making a portrait art. And I think rendering digital humans often scare artists in the wrong way. We get too bogged down by the details. It would be useful to think about this as if you were a CG director. You should be asking yourself what contributes the most to achieving a convincing digital portrait with the least amount of effort and time. Before we get started, here are some artists that I think you can check out. Nashefki Ibrahim, I think, went viral with his Anne Hathaway portrait, which was a collaboration between him and Hadi Karimi, where Hadi worked on the modeling and Shefki did the shading. Anthropus has got a lot of long form content on his YouTube channel. I think this portrait, especially, was spotlighted on Texturing XYZ. And finally, Ian Spriggs is one of the OG portrait artists and has been making waves since 2016. I think he does portraits of his friends and family. And I'm not just asking you to check out these artists for an ego check. They all have really good resources on their websites, their art stations. Shefki Ibrahim, especially, has got some really useful written tutorials on his art station. Now, some of them do sell full character courses. They're usually around the $100 mark. I would suggest that you only invest in them once you have a good enough a foundation. There's so many tutorials out there that you can watch for free. Now, without further ado, we will jump into the video, starting with tip number 1. Keep your lighting simple and stupid. No truer words had been uttered. Look, as artists, we often use a HDRI lighting and we stick with it until the very end, such that when it comes to lighting the model, we just put on a 3 point lighting and call it a day. Not that there's anything wrong with the classic 3 point lighting or even the classic Rembrandt lighting with a triangle on the model. There are many creative ways that you can use to light your subject. And depending on the subject you want to shoot, you have features that you want to accentuate, you have flaws that you want to hide with lighting. And there's so many ways that it's worth that you look up the lighting guide and make sure that you find real references of photo shoot setups and get familiar with terms like diffusers, the barn doors, or reflectors, and make sure that you have a reference for your lighting and don't just go in blind. When it comes to lighting, I always think back to the Jurassic Park scene where even back then the CG models were not as realistic. They were able to make it work because they had a simple light source in the shot where it comes from above and a diffusion heavy scene with the rain. When the T-Rex is wet, it's all just specular lighting. You don't even have to worry about subsurface scattering. I don't think it even existed back then. So to demonstrate, let me just look at my Blender scene. This is the Titus project that I was working on. I'm just going to go into render mode. By keeping lighting simple, what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you only have about like one or two lights to define the main shapes. So if I turn off all the lighting, I think my main light came from the key light comes from above. Let me just go into camera view. I'm going to switch my camera. Go into the first one. There we go. So the first key light comes from above that sort of defines the overall shape that I want to define. And once I was happy with that, I made sure that I have a very strong fill light for the face such that I can see the main features and I could see these really nice reflections in the eyes. So now all that's left is doing fill lights and perhaps rim light. So I have one profile light coming from sort of the left of the shot, and this is a very simple fill light. It's very subtle. If I turn off all the different lighting, you can see that the profile light very warm, very subtle. And then I have a rim light that comes from above to help me define the shape of the individual hair strands and the background. Let me turn on my key light and my face fill, and that's how it looks. Okay, and for a particular shot, you can always have multiple rims set up. So if I go into my cowboy shot, I use a different rim light. I think this fake rim is what I use. Very, very strong effect. I think this was composited on. I did this after the rendering, but you want to make sure that you just have a few key lights that define the shape of your rendering, and the rest is just fills, right? Because in real life, you would actually have diffusers, you would have reflectors that are held outside the boundary of the shot that you don't see, but they're actually contributing to reflection and diffusion of light. Going back to using lighting references, this is incredibly important because most of us who are 3D artists are not also great lighting artists. It is a craft and a skill in of itself that takes time to hone and perfect. So, as an amateur lighter, such as myself, it is so incredibly easy to make mistakes and fall into the loop of infinite adjustments. So if I could just demonstrate, now I've only got my key light turned on. And with a combination of light temperature, which controls the color, and the radius of the light, I can dramatically change the tone of the subject. Small light means harsher shadows, bigger light means softer shadows. I think that most of us would know, but there's so much unknown unknowns to us in the realm of lighting that we can easily mess things up, and you go back to adjusting, and you would just have multiple lights that you're trying to work with, and you don't know where to start, you don't know how to fix the problem. This is why it is far better to just copy and sort of emulate a photo shoot setup that would just work, right? And at least it'll give you a broad direction. If you like this content and want to support me, you can do so on Patreon for £1 a month. Links in the description. Tip number two, use a physical camera. I think most renderers, commercial renderers like Arnold, like Octane, Renderman, they all have a physical camera by default. And all that means is that you have access to settings that you would find in real life, like ISO, like shutter speed, like your aperture. In Blender, I'm not too sure if you can access those by default. What I'm using is an add-on called Photographer, which gives you precise control over the camera. In addition to having camera presets that you could just use. If you're lazy, you could just choose one of them. Is there a black magic? Anyway, I'm not too sure. And under exposure, you'll find the settings for shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's talk about them briefly, because in CG we actually want to create or well, recreate the camera imperfection that would happen. Whereas it's funny how photographers wish they could just come up with a crisp and clean image, such as our renders. So you definitely want to be able to know what kind of camera settings photographers would use under different scenarios. In the context of our portrait render, I'm using a relatively low aperture to get that nice depth of field. ISO controls the sensitivity to light, which we don't really need to concern ourselves with too much because our scenes would be very well lit. Shutter speed has to do with motion blur, and again, our subject is standing still, so we don't really need a high shutter speed, and all of which contributes to the overall exposure or brightness of the shot. So if I could just quickly demonstrate, if for some reason, if I set my ISO very high, then it just increases in brightness, right? And the aperture as well, if I set it to 22, becomes incredibly dim because the lens or the sensor is very wide. Let me just set back to 4.0. I think in portraits, especially like the close-ups, the most common f-stops you would see are 1.4 2, 2.4, 2.8, and 4. I don't think I've ever seen 3.5, but anyway, you can find those settings online. And so these are the sort of imperfections of cameras, or the physical attributes of cameras that we can set at render time, so you don't have to do them in post. What I would recommend you do in post are the natural artifacting that come with a real camera. So first off, we have chromatic aberration. You may see this overused in video games of a certain era, where you have just this global color shift applied to the final image. And that is not recommended because it just gives this very soft and eerie look. Chromatic aberration naturally happens along the edges of a lens, which is why it's also known as fringing, where different wavelengths of light get refracted at different angles, resulting in a color shift. And I think I have this on my final render for my Titus project. And it's even here, I feel like this is too pronounced. This is way too strong. Especially in modern cameras, you want to minimize this effect as much as you can. Next up, we have a blooming, or else a light dispersion, that happens when the light source is so strong it spills over to adjacent pixels. In the olden days, a lot of the films that don't have wide enough of a range in f-stop would often have this incredibly strong blooming effect. Again, you want to be selective, conservative with this effect. Grain, very simple, something we just add back in the compositing software. And if you remember back in the early 2000s, our flip phones, flip phone cameras are so terrible that if you tried to take a picture at night, it would be so grainy and blurry and would look something like this. Then we have lens dirt. This is something that I would recommend that you could either do at render time or in compositing, because depending on the medium of the substance that is stuck to the lens, you would have different effect. So if I have a wet lens, then there would be some kind of refraction. If I have, let's say, just a bunch of dust on the lens, then it's a very matte kind of like obstacle on the lens. So again, it's up to you how you want to do it. In portrait rendering, I would minimize this. There's barely any dirt in our lenses in such a controlled environment. Vignetting happens naturally in most optic equipment. It's something it's just an overlay. Very simple. Okay. Now that we're done with tip number 2, let's move on to tip number 3. Choose the easiest renderer. Now, a lot of people fuss over which render engine they should be using, especially as a beginner. The short answer is Blender because it's free, and the long answer is it depends on the feature set that you need. In terms of ease of use, I would argue that Arnold is the easiest to get started in. Arnold is the render engine that comes natively with Maya, and most of the works that you see on Texturing XYZ, including the ones done by these artists, were all rendered in Arnold. And mostly it's because of how it is to use, and the shaders are very simple. There's very little that you can mess around with, such that you mess up your shaders, that you mess up your render settings. When it comes to rendering characters in a production context where you have the character as well as an environment where you need to have really good global illumination solutions, then V-Ray would be king. It's possibly one of the most commonly used render solution out there. In fact, if you remember from Love, Death, Robots, there was an episode where a crew was stuck in space, and and the main protagonist ran into this woman, which turned out to be a hallucination. This was rendered in V-Ray, so V-Ray can definitely do a very good job on characters. In fact, the Titus project that I rendered in Cycles was look developed in V-Ray. So I was testing out the skin shader that comes with V-Ray. It's called V-Ray AL Surface. Very easy to set up, produces very good results right out of the box. Now, finally, we have a Blender. A Blender is a little tricky because even though it's free, there are some settings in there that isn't immediately apparent to beginners. Let me explain. When rendering a character portrait, you need to be able to subdivide the head model many, many times such that you can drive the details with a 32-bit displacement map. And in Blender, for some reason, by default, if I just go into my Titus project, when you import the 32-bit displacement map, as you see right here, it would have this option turned on by default, half float precision. What this does is that it reduces the 32-bit displacement map down to 16 bits per channel to lower the memory use during rendering. This is not really explained anywhere, and when you're rendering with half precision, you'll just be sitting there scratching your head wondering why isn't the quality matching up to your ZBrush sculpt. And in addition to that, let me just start a brand new scene and explain some of the default render settings that need to be changed so that you can more closely match what you see in Arnold. First off, when rendering a character with a lot of high resolution texture maps, we need to make sure we have enough memory. Under Edit, go into Preferences, and under System, scroll down to the bottom, make sure you have enough memory cache limit allotted. So in my instance, I set it to 0, meaning that that's unlimited. You might want to set this value according to your system specs, to the VRAM that's available to you. Make sure you have a directory set to handle the cache data. Another thing that is very important that I'm not really sure what's happening. Maybe this only applies to the viewport, but when rendering at when rendering something, you don't render the stuff that is outside of the camera frustum. So I have the default scene has a camera. Let me just go into camera mode and pilot the camera. Anything that is outside of the camera frustum should not be calculated at all, right? And Blender has a camera calling feature, and it's off by default just to be safe. I'm sure that it's not really rendering everything else when you hit F12, but just to be sure, you have camera calling turned on. And another thing that's very important is that the default light balances may be insufficient for characters because we have, for instance, the eyeball where you have an iris, which is a geometry that is behind a transmissive medium, that is the eye. So when setting light balances, the default value is it's good for most average use cases, but for the context of characters, I recommend that you set it to full global illumination. This cranks everything up to 32 and drastically increases the render time. So at this point, when you hit render, you may run into the issue of crashing, and that is because by default, Blender renders the entire tile at once, which I don't know why. So in output, let's say if I have an output image of, well, the standard 1920 by 1080, if you go under performance, and under memory, you'll see the option to use tiling. This should be on by default nonetheless. I don't know why this is the case because for most people, they use their CPU to render, and CPUs render small tiles more efficiently than rendering big tiles. So make sure you have use tiling turned on so you calculate a small portion of the overall pixels at any given moment. I would set it to 64 for CPU. And if you're using exclusively GPU for rendering, then you set it to a high value such that you take advantage of the parallel computation of your GPU. I think it's off because most people are rendering in Blender with CUDA, so a combination of CPU and GPU. In that case, you want to have a tile size in between, so maybe 256. Experiment with different values and see if you still crash. And I think that's about it. So, as a final note, it gets a little complicated. It may be outside the scope of this video, but I think it's still worth mentioning. And that has to do with MIPS. So, let me get the page pulled up. I'll link this down below if you're interested in reading, but this is highly technical and I may not do the best job at explaining it. Long story short, there was a discussion on the Blender forums a long, long time ago where users pointed out there were no optimization features to handle big textures when using cycles. So they pointed out features such as texture cache and mip maps. In the case of Arnold, you may remember that whenever you render something in Arnold, a .tx file is generated. Basically, these are optimization features so that you minimize the amount of RAM being used. And for the longest time, Blender never really had the feature set in their roadmap, and people were kind of confused and not sure if it would ever be implemented so that it can compete with other commercial renderers, especially in the context of production. So you can imagine how this is incredibly important for our use case when making character portraits because we are dealing with really heavy texture maps. I'm not sure if this would ever come in future releases, but as a temporary solution in Blender, like I mentioned before, you can always render in smaller tile sizes. It may come at a cost of render time, or there are different add-ons that I don't have yet, but I have seen some add-ons that basically generate MIPS for all the objects in your scene, and thereby reducing the memory overhead. For those who are interested in a render comparison of the same character using Cycles, Arnold, and V-Ray, you can check out my Artstation. I'll put the link down below. This is a fan art project for Kaiju 8 from the manga. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can find them. Tip number four, look dev by channel. Now, when it comes to shading your character, it's likely that you've got a HDRI setup, you are ready to plug in all of your texture maps, you have them exported from your texturing software of choice, most likely Substance Painter, so you have an idea of how the character is going to look. You plug them in to the shaders, and lo and behold, they don't look the way you expect. You then start messing with the settings in the shaders, you readjust your textures, you perhaps even go as far as to changing some render settings. Then the next thing you know, 4 hours have elapsed and you still are nowhere close to addressing the problem. Then you start looking online for solutions where people tell you to look at AOVs, through process of elimination, you find the issue. My advice is to avoid that to begin with, right? When you're working with a character that has subsurface scattering, so, human characters or creatures, it's quite tricky because subsurface scattering itself can diminish the perceived strength of your specularity and the details that are brought on by the 32-bit displacement map. So it's very important that you go in this pipeline, should I say, in this sequence where you can be sure that you haven't gone wrong with your displacement or reflection, if you leave the coloring, the subsurface scattering to the very last step. I'm sure people may do things differently, but this is the sequence that I prefer to go in, and it's worked for me so far. It saved me a ton of time. So how exactly do you do that? Well, first you load in the model. Then you have your 32-bit displacement map loaded. Make sure you subdivide your model a plenty and set it to a diffuse color of 50% gray or 18% gray. It's up to you. Then, once the displacement looks somewhat similar to what you have in your ZBrush sculpt, you can then move on to reflection. This is where you could either look at just the specular reflection channel, or you could just set the diffuse color of your head model to black, which this would apply to maybe game engines. Then this can help you just purely focus on the reflection of the skin. And this is quite tricky because in dealing with reflection, we have two input maps. We have roughness and specularity. And on top of that, for human skin, we have a phenomenon known as dual lobe reflection. This is something we'll talk about later. But for now, just know that in this step, you're going to have to figure out your reflection, get it to a place where you're satisfied. Then you move on to the coloring. This is where you use your diffuse map as your SSS color. Then You would have a radius map. Sometimes you would have a region map where you define how much subsurface scattering effect is applied, similar to what you see in the video game SSS maps. So this is a real-time texture set for Unreal Engine. So a scatter map, a region map looks like this. If I set subsurface scattering to 1, then everywhere else it's being applied at zero point 0.5, so 50%. Whereas around the ears and the eyelids, it's full scattering, right, at 1, which is why it's pure white. In any case, for path tracing, it's not always needed. I haven't really need to use a region map so far. Just having a radius map and the subsurface scattering or the color map itself would be sufficient. All right, now let's talk about some of the tricky stuff for texturing this or for shading the skin. In addition to dual lobe reflection, we also need to talk about subdermal color. So let's start with the reflection itself. Dual lobe reflection is a phenomenon, or should I say, a graphical approximation of the complex reflection we have on our skin. I haven't been able to find the exact science behind it in the same way that you can find the algorithms or functions used behind light transportation, which is what graphics is. Graphics is basically physics. The earliest documents I could find were made by DAZ 3D. If you know Daz, I may not know who you are, but I know what you are. Okay. So, according to Unreal Engine's documentation, dual lobe specular is basically using two specular lobes. So, in this case, we have a softer lobe, which seems to have a roughness value of maybe zero point 0.4, zero point 0.5. And then you combine that with a tighter lobe that has a roughness of maybe zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.2. And then you combine them in a weighted average, right? So it's not just added together. You have a weighted average where you get a little bit of both. So in this case, it seems like maybe the softer lobe has 60 to 70% of the weight, and the tighter lobe has about 20 to 30% of the weight. And there are many kinds of implementations, right? You can do this in a number of ways, and I think I'll show you all of them later on. But just know that dual lobe reflection is all about achieving this this look. We have on our skin, especially on our faces, we have peach fuzz. These are tiny vellus hairs that are clustered up where if light hits it at an angle, they obviously give off reflection, right? So if you look at the skin, it seems as though it's a maybe a roughness value of zero point 0.4, zero point 0.5. But in these areas, let me just zoom in where the hairs are catching reflection. And if you view it from far, far away, it looks as if it's rough. So we need a roughness value for that, and then we need a roughness value for the skin itself. My theory is that that's what dual lobe reflection is trying to achieve. In the case of V-Ray, I know this is distracting. I'll talk about this later, okay? I promise. So in the example of V-Ray, there is a shader called AL shader. And within the AL shader, it has two reflections already built in. So this is with a clear-cut intention of having dual lobe specularity, where, just ignore everything from distribution and onwards. All these are fine-tuning settings. You can set the reflection strength and the roughness value for the first lobe. So in this case, I've set it to a roughness value of 0.25, and the weight I've assigned is 15%. The second reflection has a weight of 85%, and the roughness is 0.45. So that's the easiest way. But in cycles, you may have to do it in a different way. And in Arnold, some people utilize coat and specular roughness together to achieve this reflection. Although I don't think that is the right way to go about it. In any case, let me show you what I mean. So starting with Blender. So here we are in my Blender project for my Titus portrait shot. Now, the rendered view does not have a subdivision turned on, so mind you, this is not the final look. But just to show you that I know this looks a bit complex, but it's basically a duplicate. Well, these two are the same. So I duplicated my original shading network, and basically, one shading network has a a higher roughness value of zero point 0.5, and another one has a lower roughness value of 0.25. I then combine them using Fresnel as my mask, and I basically remap my Fresnel term into achieving the weighted average that I want, right? So in most cases, I like a 3 to 7 ratio. So let's start with Fresnel. Why am I doing that? It's not exactly, I wouldn't say it's the right way, but it works. So uh, earlier I showed you this Dark Souls invader, and oh, the good old days. It's Dark Souls 3, no? The Fresnel effect that you see here is applied to an emissive red color, right? So Fresnel basically gives you a range where surfaces that are pointing towards the camera are usually black with with a value of 0. So the red color is not applied at all. But as the surfaces start to veer away into a perpendicular angle, so it's grazing angle, it becomes a value of 1, where so it's so the red color goes through, which is why you get this ghostly kind of halo effect. In the same way, I basically use that as my mask. So if I show you just the Fresnel term, just Control Shift click, you can see that I've managed to get a range where faces that are pointing towards my camera is black, and faces that are perpendicular or grazing appears white. And using a color ramp, I can remap that, right? Because if I were to use this, then it's the contrast is too much. It's a 0 to 1. What you want to do is to have a weighted average. So in my color ramp, my first stop, I set it to a value of 0.85. I think, oh, sorry, no, that's the second stop. So stop 0, I have a value of 0.15. And stop number 2, I have a value of 0.85. And with that as the new mask, I basically have my weighted average. I just reconnect that back, and there we go. So that's my quick and dirty method for Blender, because the using the standard BSDF shader, I did not have the luxury of dual specular lobe. Um, at least it doesn't have those parameters. You may be able to download some custom shaders that have that, but if you're using Blender, you just want to plug your textures in with the standard shader, which is Principled BSDF. This is one way you can go about doing it. You can find more information for this setup on my Artstation page, which I'll link. It's a bit difficult to look at these individual nodes on a compressed YouTube video. All right, let's see how you would go about doing this in Arnold, where I've seen how some other people do it. With my Maya scene opened, let's have a look at the most common dual lobe specularity setup for Arnold AI standard surface. All you really have to do is to load in a specular map for the skin. Then you plug the spec map into the specular weight slot as well as the coat weight slot. If you were to just plug them in right away, it's just going to be full specular reflection and full coat reflection, and that's just going to be too shiny. So we need to do a weighted average, as we discussed before. To do that, I simply use an AI multiply node. So you can get that by typing AI mult and plug the specular map in to the mult for input 1, and we multiply that by zero point 0.8. So this is going to be 80% of the reflection, which is going to be used on the softer lobe, which is why I have set the roughness of the softer lobe to 0.45. In the same vein, you multiply the spec map by zero point 0.2 for the title lobe, which is under the coat channel. I will then set the roughness to a much lower value of 0.25. If you have a roughness map, you can also just plug them into the roughness slot respectively. You can also use a math node where you multiply the roughness map by a certain amount of power to achieve, a softer lobe and a tighter lobe, and then you combine those. There's a lot of freedom in the way that you can do this. This is just the displacement shader, so you don't have to worry too much. Let's have a look at the result. So Once rendered, I'm using a 18% gray on my head model. You get to have some really nice front-facing highlights, and overall, it's just a bit. It's a more complex reflection, I guess. So, what I can show you. This is the softer lobe, the 80%, and this is the 25% that I had on the title lobe. Then this is the combined result. Last but not least, we need to talk about subdermal color. In setting up subsurface scattering, the three most important inputs are color, scale, and radius. The color input is simply your diffuse map, and scale controls the scattering radius. And the scattering radius, in turn, is defined by a float 3. In this case, it's mapped to RGB. Typically, for skin, this RGB color would appear reddish because you want red to scatter the deepest, followed by green and blue. In the olden days, we actually had to produce separate texture maps to indicate the scattering distance. So, a deep red color, which is often blurred, to indicate deep scatter. Mid scatter is usually the original map, or sometimes bluish. It depends on the render engine you use. And green for shallow scatter. So let's have a look at the difference between using an RGB value for radius and using a texture map for the radius. So in the example on the right, I am using a flat color of 1 for red, 0.35 for green, and zero point 0.2 for blue. This is the value suggested by Arnold on their official documentation. The downside to this is that you can sometimes get more scattering in areas that you don't expect. In my case, I'm getting a lot of scattering on the nose bridge, which is not very natural. Whereas by using a saturated version of your diffuse map, you naturally highlight areas that already have a lot of red in them. So in this case, the nose is kind of yellowish and brownish and thus will not have that much scattering. We can do a very quick check in this example where if I zoom into the nose and that issue is resolved. So by highlighting areas that are already red on your diffuse map, you can often get a more accurate result. In this case, I'm getting a lot more red on the eyelids, getting a lot more red on the border of the lips. If you look at the philtrum, you get a very nice blend. So, long story short, I would recommend that you use a subdermal map for scattering. Um, but in the case where you don't need to zoom in too much to the character's face, it is entirely worth it to not have that texture map because texture adds to your memory overhead. Okay, with that with that done, I think we can move on to the final tip. Tip number 5, use scanned assets. It goes without saying that most realistic characters use scanned textures to achieve the highest fidelity. And Texturing XYZ is probably the most well known source, where they have a three-channeled approach to their displacement map. And this gives you a lot of control over the displacement effect. All of their textures come as 32-bit EXRs, so it's a very wide range of data that you get to play with. 3D Scan Store is more geared towards real time rendering, and they have a huge selection where they incorporate their 3D scans into Unreal Engine's MetaHuman. I think it's called Unreal Engine's Identity. In any case, they have both head and full bodied models with great topology, and all of their models share the same UV, meaning you could just transfer one texture set to another. At the very least, you should have some skin brushes that were made using scans, and these can be incredibly useful when patching up your displacement details in ZBrush. But if, like me, you're broke, you may be interested in grabbing some free resources. First off, 3D Scan Store has this head model and texture free for download. I'll link it in the description. You'll need Marmoset Toolbag to open up the preview scene, otherwise, the model is in FBX and the textures are in PNG format. Digital Emily is a free resource pack available for download from the Wikihuman project website. And this is also an incredibly interesting project to read if you want to learn about how they scan the textures. And you may have seen this model all over YouTube because it's free. So they're all contained within a Maya file. So that's what you need to open it. And finally, you can get a lot of free character models from Character Creator by Relusion. So fun fact, I used to work for them. A lot of people don't know this, but if you trial the software, you can download all the base characters and then export them. And this will give you a bunch of good base meshes and textures to use as a starting point. You'll get a very diverse collection in terms of skin color, age, and sex. Great. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. I'll get to your questions as soon as I can. Otherwise, like and subscribe if it's been helpful to you, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.